Welcome, everyone. Good morning. My name is Esther Manheimer, Mayor of the City of Asheville. I'd like to welcome you to the January 4th, 2024 Agenda Briefing Work Session. Happy New Year. All council members and staff are participating virtually. The live meeting will be streamed on the city's YouTube channel, accessed through the YouTube icon on the front page of the city's website, or via the live stream. The live meeting will be available on Charter Spectrum Channel 193. And you can listen to the meeting by phone by dialing 855-925-2801 with meeting code 3567. And we do not, just as a reminder, we do not take public comment during the agenda review meeting. Council and staff, please unmute yourselves and say a quick hello when I call your name. First of all, Vice Mayor Sandra Kilgore.
Good morning, everyone.
Councilwoman Antoinette Mosley.
Hello.
Councilwoman Kim Roney.
Good morning.
Councilwoman Maggie Holman.
Hey, everybody. Happy New Year.
And Sage Turner and Shanika Smith are unable to be present today at the agenda review. We also have for staff, our city manager, Deborah Campbell.
Good morning.
Our assistant city manager, Rachel Wood.
Good morning.
Our assistant city manager, Ben Woody.
Good morning.
Our city attorney, Brad Branham.
Good morning.
Our city clerk, Maggie Burleson.
Good morning.
Okay, and we're now going to turn it over to the city manager, Deborah Campbell.
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning again and Happy New Year. Welcome to your first council agenda briefing meeting of 2024. And as you know, the goal of these meetings is to review the agendas for your upcoming meetings. Your first city council meeting of 2024 is scheduled for next Tuesday, January 9th, starting at 5 o'clock. Assistant City Manager Rachel Wood will be our facilitator for our meeting this morning. We'll thoroughly review the agenda items for the upcoming business meeting, council committee meetings, and upcoming 8-week agenda items. But it is highly likely we will spend the majority of our time today discussing the items under the other issues and updates. There's 2 items. I'll briefly share with you critical paths for your upcoming council retreat. And then planning staff will provide a deep dive into our recently completed missing middle study. We hope that in this format, you'll have the opportunity to ask detailed questions, get a clearer understanding of the study findings and recommendations, and what our proposed next steps are regarding implementation of those recommendations. But before I turn it over to Rachel, I just want to take some personal privileges to say thank you to you, Mayor and Council, our exceptional staff, and the community for your support, your patience, your encouragement, and even your criticism in 2023 as we attempted to provide exemplary public service. It was indeed a pretty tough year, but together we made it through, and I assure you, we are stronger and wiser. Thanks again for all you do, and I look forward to another year working with and for you to improve the lives of the people we serve. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to review our first agenda item, which is the January 9th council business meeting agenda. Rachel.
Thank you, Deborah, and good morning again and Happy New Year, Mayor and City Council. As Deborah mentioned, the Tuesday, January 9th meeting does begin at 5 p.m. There is not a work session scheduled for that meeting. We do not currently have any proclamations scheduled, so I'm going to hop down to the consent portion of the agenda. As is our typical process, I'm going to highlight a few items, but if I skip over one where you have questions, please let me know and we'll be happy to cover the items that I skip over. The first item I'm going to cover is items B, 1, and 2. This is a two-part action to accept what I'm calling a grant/loan from the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality and approve the associated budget amendment to help identify lead service lines, lead connection, or galvanized service lines on both the public and private side of water lines. This reimbursement grant, we're up to $1.4 million, or 70% of the total expenditures are forgiven, and 100% of the project will be performed in areas deemed underserved by NCDEQ's community mapping and the City of Asheville's climate justice map. I'm going to skip down to item D. Item D also pertains to the water utility. NCDOT, as we all know, is making improvements associated with the I-26 connector project to I-40 and I-240 between I-40 exit 44 and the I-40 I-240 interchange. These improvements will impact and require relocating approximately 100 feet of water line along Montgomery Street and 705 feet of water line along Sand Hill Road. The municipal agreement will establish the reimbursement and procedure to NCDOT for the costs incurred associated with this project. The City of Asheville is responsible for 50% of the engineering and construction cost of the required water line relocation. Moving down to item F. Item F is a $2.1 million contract with CDM Smith for the Phase 2 Mills River Upgrades project. CDM Smith provided design services for the project and is well positioned to perform construction administration to ensure the success of the project. This project is aligned with recommendations made by the Independent Review Committee. Examples of project components include additional off-stream storage, a third wastewater lagoon, additional finished storage, replacement of several bulk chemical storage tanks, replacement of mixers, flocculators, which I learned is a word for chemical lines, and various transferring pumps and updating all lighting for more energy efficiency at the Mills River Water Treatment Plant. Moving on to item G is a resolution authorizing the city manager to enter into a $115,000 one-year contract with 2 optional one-year renewals with Jefferson Wells to provide contract internal audit services to the city. And we have tried desperately to hire an internal auditor to no avail. And we have done extensive outreach. And since we have not been successful in hiring the internal auditor, the next best option is to contract for those services until we are able to find a candidate. So this is going to be the first year trying this out. We're going to have some internal staff support augmenting these services. But if it works out, then we have the option to renew for 2 additional years under this contract with Jefferson Wells. Moving on, I'm going to skip to item J. Item J pertains to an additional sole source contract with IPS Group Incorporated. Parking Services is currently in the process of transitioning from IPS meters to McKay meters because of performance issues with the IPS meters. There are currently about 450 IPS meters remaining in the city stock. While the transition continues, it's necessary for the city to continue to utilize the IPS meters and the back-end software provided by IPS to ensure they remain operational while needed. That's the primary reason for the requested $179,000 contract. Staff is confident that the full transition will be complete in less than 2 years, and once we fully transition to McKay, we will no longer have a need for support from IPS. Yes, Councilmember Roney.
This might be helpful for maybe a follow-up, but it would help me understand what is the revenue loss from the maintenance issues, and it seems interesting that we're backdating it because the equipment wasn't working. So maybe it would help to have some more information about the why and some of the details.
Sure, and I can note that
And it-
we're not backdating it because of the issues. We're backdating it because the contract lapsed on June 30th. And so, but we can get some additional details. I believe the issues were identified proactively, but I can let you know in follow-up materials if we have any documentation of revenue loss, for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, next item, item K. On February 14th, council may recall you authorized the city manager to sign a funding letter of commitment to the NCDOT regarding the city betterments and aesthetic treatments for sections B and D of the I-26 connector project. At the time of the funding letter of commitment was sent, the anticipated cost of the aesthetics treatments was just shy of $5.9 million, and the betterments was $1.4 million for a total of about $7.3 million. The estimated cost of the aesthetics treatments has not changed and will not change. As a quick reminder, NCDOT is proceeding with a design build. So once we enter into this agreement for the construction work, our costs will not change. So any overages will be borne by NCDOT and not the city. So the 5.9 million for the aesthetics treatment is not changing. The estimated cost of the betterments, however, has actually decreased by 283,500 to account for items required under NCDOT's complete street policy that the city previously thought it would have to pay for. The latest estimate of 1.129 million will not change. So that's what the locked-in rate that we have for the betterments. The anticipated award date for the I-26 design build firm is February 2024, and the anticipated start of construction date is February 2025. The city has an interest-free time period of 3 years from the anticipated start of construction date to pay for the betterments and aesthetic improvements, and funds are budgeted appropriately in the city's 5-year CIP. Last item that I plan to cover is item M. Item M is for a construction contract for phase 2 of the Stevens Lee renovation project. It's being funded with remaining CDBG funds that were previously approved for phase 1 of the Stevens Lee project. Those funds were approved by HCD in March of 2022. This 121 contract with J. Bartholomew Construction for phase 2 will complete the renovation of the second floor restrooms, including resized accessible toilets, new toilet partitions and accessories, new plumbing fixtures, and new floor and wall tile. Moving on to presentations and reports, under the city manager's report, we're going to have the introduction of our new fire chief, Michael Case, who I believe had his first day with the city of Asheville on January 2nd. I will now turn it over to Ben Woody to cover public hearings.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, Mayor, Council. You only have one public hearing for this meeting, and it's a relatively straightforward request. I am going to share my screen and show a site plan. I think that will help in terms of kind of orienting you to the property. So this was a property that was approved previously by council in October of 2018. It was approved to allow a 106-room hotel as well as establish an out parcel. The hotel has been constructed, so it is there, and this property is off Brevard Road. It's adjacent to Interstate 40 and near Interstate 240. At the time of approval in 2018, council added a condition that prohibited drive-through uses. So the applicant has come back and requested that that condition be removed. One of the things that Planning and Zoning Commission and city staff required in order to consider the removal of that drive-through limitation was to have the applicant provide a site plan. Then you can see the site plan here. So this would now, if approved, be binding with the revised conditional zoning. And what this does is allow the drive-through uses as well as establish some of the sidewalk connections to both of the public sidewalks and adjoining businesses. A little bit of context on this. At the time of 2018, I think the thought was that perhaps this area The development pattern here would be a little more pedestrian oriented. It's continued to be an auto oriented development pattern. So I think staff as well as Planning and Zoning Commission have recognized that, and as part of their recommendation in favor, so both staff and P&Z are recommending in favor, was the establishment of a site-specific site plan, including these pedestrian connections. So any questions on our public hearing item? Councilwoman Roney.
I remember this, but I was just in the audience when this was passed, and there was a conversation about the future of that corridor and connectivity. And I appreciate you mentioning the concern about walkability. I think if what I'm hearing with the staff recommendation is because it's currently auto oriented, we would allow this change. But I wonder how that fits with our long-term plans and Living Asheville Comprehensive Plan on the future orientation of this area.
I don't want to put our Assistant Planning Director, Chris Collins, on the spot, but I am. And I don't know if, Chris, if you're able to answer that today or if we want to kind of hold that and be prepared to discuss that at Tuesday's meeting. So, Chris, what do you?
I can offer some initial thoughts on that.
Okay.
But it might not be a completely in-depth answer. So one of the peculiar things about this part of the city, as we head down Brevard Road, is the proximity of county jurisdiction to city jurisdiction. And while we haven't seen a lot of new development applications come in within the city limits as we head down Brevard Road, we are seeing more, or the county is seeing more, in the form of more auto dealerships and things like that. So when Ben said we're seeing kind of an auto-dependent pattern continue, it's happening outside of our jurisdiction as well. But when staff looked at this, as Ben said, it was, well, this is here, this hotel, which is not very pedestrian oriented to begin with, is here. But the main thing we'd like to see is a commitment within this request to connect the pedestrian network and continue to create a functional pedestrian network. So that's kind of my initial answer for you.
Thank you. I see there's some other hands up.
Yeah, could you put the map up and just do a little more walkthrough since we don't have the staff report now? I figured it's probably 30 seconds for you to show us, like, where was it closed off? Where are they walking through? Where are the pedestrian connections proposed? Please and thank you.
So I've got the site plan up, and Chris may be better positioned to walk you through than I am, but I will note, so I'm going to try to use my cursor, which is not showing up. So if you see on the lower end of the site plan, you can see the outline of the hotel. So that is existing. On the upper end of the site plan, the north end, you can see the orange box. That would be the proposed building for a future use that would have a drive-through. And you can see the dark lines. Those are the sidewalk connections. So you can see they kind of wrap the building. You have one that goes out to the sidewalk on Brevard Road. You would have the ability to get to Bear Creek Road sidewalk. And then of course you can see the sidewalk connection that then goes down to the existing hotel.
Okay.
And of course, it just is I think staff certainly at the meeting on Tuesday, your public hearing can be prepared to maybe have more imagery and highlight that better. I think that would be something we could do.
I think this is just helpful. I know some people in the world are extremely versed with reading these plans quickly, but that saves some time for me and the public. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions on this item? And again, we'll have the public hearing on Tuesday, and of course, staff will provide a little more detailed presentation than I have. If not, I will turn it back over to Rachel.
Thanks, Ben. So the only remaining item we have for Tuesday's council meeting under new business is your standard boards and commissions appointments. Ben is actually going to cover this in a little more detail as a part of his overview for the upcoming boards and commissions committees. So that concludes our review of the January 9th council meeting. And I'm actually going to turn it back over to Ben now to cover the Planning and Economic Development Committee.
Thank you, Rachel. I probably could have just kept going, I guess, but we have our Planning and Economic Development Committee meeting scheduled for Monday, January 8th. And we have 4 items on that agenda. First, we have an update from the Public Art and Cultural Commission. We will have the chair of that body who will attend and provide an annual update on the work of that commission, as well as some of the things they want to work on and accomplish in 2024. If as council remembers, in October of 2023, we had a request from a resident to amend the UDO regarding flag lots and cottage clusters. At your October meeting, council continued that to your second January meeting, and you asked staff to do some additional outreach and engagement around those potential changes. Staff has done that, and they're going to provide an initial report to PED on their work around the flag lot and potential cottage cluster changes. So we'll review that with PED before it goes to council. Also at that meeting, the petitioner, Barry Bialik, will be in attendance, so he'll be able to provide information and answer questions as well. Our next item on the PED agenda is a review by our transportation staff of some of the work they've done on personal micromobility devices. So as council's aware, there are a lot of changes, technology and use-wise, in terms of how people use micromobility to get around. Our transportation department has done some analysis and work on that, and they're going to share some proposed policy updates related to micromobility ordinance changes. These are not consideration of the actual ordinance changes. This is just going to be a review to get some initial feedback from PED on that potential suite of changes. And then the last thing is we are going to have a discussion on the Patton Avenue design speed limit. This is related to the I-26 connector project. So as council is aware, the Patton Avenue from the Bowen Bridge to Clingman Avenue is going to be reclaimed or become a western entryway to the downtown area, and it will no longer be an interstate facility. So what this conversation will do is discuss some of the changes or some of the speed limit possibilities that may impact future design of that section of corridor. So again, this is just an informational discussion to talk about what that corridor could look like in the future and how that connects to the Patton Avenue corridor study work that planning is undertaking right now. So only 4 items, but pretty dense items for PED. Any questions on those? Okay, with that, then I think I am going to turn it over to Deborah to review Policy, Finance, and HR Committee.
All righty. Thank you, Ben. Our meeting is scheduled for January 9th at 10 o'clock. And we have 2 items on the agenda, in addition to obviously public comment. But we will not be requesting, staff will not be requesting any action from these particular items. The first one is the review council code of ethics. And we thought that we would start with this committee first. We do intend, though, to also have this be a topic at your retreat. And again, this will be for information only, and our esteemed city attorney, Brad Branham, will be presenting this information. The second item is just, again, for information, and this will be an update on the budget process. It's kind of a budget kickoff, and we will provide detailed information about the budget process, including a discussion of some of the key deadlines and schedules for a GO bond, if that is something that you all want to consider in the upcoming year. So those are the 2 items on our Policy, Finance, and Human Resources Committee agenda. Yes, Ms. Roney.
Hopefully this is a quick question. I did send an email about this, but I've heard from some neighbors who got a survey mailing that was unique to their households. And in the past or last year, I appreciated that we did a survey or outreach really early in the budget process. Will we doing that again at a public level, or are we doing a more narrow focused survey this time?
No, we're doing as much outreach as possible. And during the meeting, we will be discussing all of the different avenues and ways we are trying to reach out to get the public informed. Also, there will be, I think one of those questions you asked was, will there be an opportunity for someone to show up at a council meeting? And we will have that on an agenda. I think it might be in the 26th or early February, but we'll have all that detailed information for you at the meeting on Tuesday. All right, that's all I have. I think, Ben, you back up?
Back to me. Yep. Thank you, Deborah.
All right.
Our next item is the Boards and Commissions Committee, and we have 4 items for that agenda. The first is, as Rachel mentioned on the council agenda, is Boards and Commissions kind of has their normal suite of recommendations to advisory boards. So you'll work through those and bring those recommendations back to full council. I do want to highlight one change that we made for one of the boards. So for the Metropolitan Sewage District Board, which City Council has an appointment to that board. Real quickly, initially Councilwoman Ullman had expressed interest, but she has withdrawn her interest as an appointment to that board. So what we have for consideration is Gwen Whistler, who's currently the appointee to the board. She is interested in continuing that work. We also have as well, Councilwoman Mosley, Smith, and Vice Mayor Kilgore are also interested in that appointment. So we have a number of people that are interested in that, and just wanted to highlight that is a change from the initial draft agenda that was sent out. Moving on, we have 3 other items that the clerk's office, will provide updates on. One is they are going to review the demographics report for our committee membership. That includes current membership and 2023 application demographics. So you'll get a kind of a deep dive on that. They are going to review the new proposed application form that will be used for committee appointments, and that's going to launch in the spring, hopefully. And finally, they're going to give, the clerk's office will provide a committee, that's a Boards and Commissions Committee year-end report for your review. So a lot of information to cover, a lot of appointments to cover at that forthcoming meeting. Any questions on any of those items? If not, I will turn it over to Rachel for the last 2 council committee items.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, both the Housing and Community Development Committee as well as the Equity and Engagement Committee are scheduled to meet next on January 16th. So I'll start with an overview of HCD, which is scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock on January 16th. The first substantive item on the agenda is Emily Ball will be leading an update on the revised governance structure for the continuum of care. After that presentation, the committee will be asked to resend a previously approved $1.2 million housing trust fund loan for the Pineview condominiums project. That project is no longer being built at the site. Next on the agenda is an affordable housing plan update. This conversation will be led by Sasha Vertunsky. Sasha is going to provide a general overview of the work the enterprise is doing, assessing the city's affordable housing tools, including the policy review of the land use incentive grant program and the housing trust fund program. As part of Sasha's presentation, the committee will be asked to consider pausing the acceptance of land use incentive grant applications for a period between now and May or June of 2024. We're still working through the details on those dates with Enterprise right now, so that that more holistic review of our affordable housing tools and the more specific review of the land use incentive grant policy review can occur. So if the committee ends up approving this, then the city council would subsequently be asked to also approve the potential pause on acceptance of land use incentive grant applications until enterprises work on the affordable housing plan update is completed. Moving on to Equity and Engagement Committee, which is scheduled for 1 p.m. on the 16th. The first substantive item is a discussion in response to a request from the Equity and Engagement Committee to identify additional funds to support the Strategic Partnership Grant Program. You'll be hearing from Tony McDowell as well as Rachel Taylor, talking through process considerations and potential options for additional funds to support that program. The other item will be an update on our neighborhood matching grants process that will be led by our CAPE team. Barring any questions for Equity and Engagement Committee, we'll then transition to a quick review of the 8-week agenda items. January 23rd is our next council meeting after the January 9th meeting. This includes public hearings on the UDO amendments for flag lot standards and cottage development standards. Also, under new business, there will be the public comment opportunity for FY 2025 budget priorities, which Deborah referenced as part of her review of the Policy, Finance, and HR Committee. Additional details regarding how we're seeking feedback on the budget process will be shared at Tuesday's Policy, Finance, and HR Committee. And then Councilmember Roney, we are preparing a response to your questions that will be included in the follow-up materials that will go out on Tuesday, follow-up materials from today's agenda briefing. And I did want to note that we just completed the National Community Survey. And so residents may have received the National Community Survey, and there were some questions related to the city's budget process in there. And so that might have added some confusion regarding that being how we're soliciting feedback versus the more targeted approach that we're taking with surveys for the city's budget process moving forward. So we'll explain that in the follow-up materials.
Thank you.
Moving on to February 13th, I'll just note that February 13th, if the Housing and Community Development Committee at the January 16th meeting does approve recommending that pause of accepting land use incentive grant applications, February 13th would be the meeting where the full city council would be voting on that potential resolution. After February 13th, the next council meeting will be February 27th. And in between the February 13th and February 27th meeting is our council retreat. And Deborah is actually going to cover some details related to the upcoming city council retreat on February 22nd and 23rd. So I will turn it over to Deborah.
All righty, thank you, Rachel. As you noted, we are excited about your council retreat. It just gives us an opportunity for us to kind of get together and spend some quality time regarding planning for the upcoming year. The retreat is scheduled for February 22nd and 23rd. That's a Thursday and a Friday. It'll be held at Harris Cherokee Center in the banquet room. We have a local facilitator, Dr. Amy Clymer, with Clymer Consultant, that will be our facilitator this year. And we actually put this item on your agenda because there is a critical path in terms of you will be getting a email from Ms. Clymer regarding scheduling a meeting to have some one-on-one conversations with you all to help us solidify the agenda, to make sure that as part of the retreat, we are covering subject matters and topics that you all want to discuss at the retreat. The actual meetings will be scheduled the week of January the 22nd and then the week of January the 29th. We will be, again, shaping up the agenda following those conversations, meeting with the mayor, and then getting back with you all with the final details regarding the agenda. Any questions regarding? Okay, so just expect an email And then she will have a calendar for you all to just sign up for a date that's convenient for you. So I appreciate that. So we're going to move on to our next item, which Videla will be reviewing with planning staff the missing middle housing study update. And I want to, just before Videla starts, is to thank the planning staff. This was a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of work. We had a task force or committee that helped in terms of the scope and just monitoring the progress of the development of this study. But I think more importantly for this particular meeting, we have places where we're going to stop the presentation, allow you all to ask us questions. This is a really important study for us. I attended with a number of other managers a meeting at the Land of Sky yesterday, and the subject matter was about affordable housing and the incredible need within not just Asheville, but in our entire region and in Western North Carolina, and quite frankly, nationally. This is a tremendous challenge for most communities. And there are a number of strategies that are being undertaken to try to mitigate, respond to these tremendous challenges. This particular study is one that helps, we think, begin to address this issue. It is not the panacea by any stretch of the imagination. It is one of the things that we need to start potentially pursuing in order to address this significant community challenge, national challenge. So Videla, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Deborah, good morning, council members. And we are happy to have the final missing middle housing study for you all to review and to discuss. Next slide, please. First, some key takeaways for everybody to consider. Number one, like Deborah mentioned, we have a significant housing crisis and there's a lack of affordability. And this study is one tool that will help to provide more guidance and information to staff and to the public. Number two, a key finding from this report is that the focus on single family home production will not suffice if we are to increase affordability in Asheville. So that's a sort of a new bit of information that we haven't discussed in the past. Number three, they provide 43 recommendations and 14 anti-displacement strategies as part of a comprehensive approach to how we can address middle housing in Asheville. So this points to the fact that there's a lot in this document, and we don't propose to take it all on at once, but we'll give you some ideas for how we can look at it and how we can look at next steps. And finally, number four, that the implementation of these recommendations would lead to more housing opportunity and more diverse housing options for residents in the city of Asheville. By the way, I am unfortunately in a sub-ideal location, so there may be some background noise. Sorry about that in advance. Next slide. Quickly to sort of frame out how we'll be approaching this in the slide deck. We'll be talking about what is the housing problem, what is middle housing, how can middle housing provide Asheville with benefits, what does the study conclude, and how do we plan to implement it? Next slide. So first of all, when we think about what is the housing problem, we should just recognize that we live in a beautiful city, and this is partly why we are experiencing such a demand for housing here. People are coming here to visit. they decide to move here. They're deciding to retire here. And so there's a lot of success. This is part of our success story. And so we, I think, at least need to pause to acknowledge that. Next slide. The downside is that the result has been that housing prices have increased dramatically. This is from the MLS, the Realtors organization, that shows over the last 10 years that the average home sales price in Asheville and Buncombe County is now in the mid $400,000, almost $500,000 range, and it's doubled in the last 10 years. And rents have gone up significantly as well, while the wages haven't gone up. So there's an imbalance here, and so you all know this, but this is important to remember and to see current data. Next slide. So what is missing middle housing? In a nutshell, these are house scale buildings, so 1 to 2.5 or 3 stories tall, that normally have multiple units within one structure. Not always. The townhouse and cottage developments are the exception, but usually they're multiple units and they're compatible with neighborhood scale. And because they are more efficient, having 2 or more units within a structure, they tend to be more attainable in price. They tend to be smaller units and typically have a lower price point. Next slide. It's also important to know that this is part of Asheville's history. If you go around, especially I think the Montford neighborhood is the best example in Asheville, you will see duplexes, triplexes, small apartment houses with these structures. And here are a few examples. A really nice duplex on the left, triplex on the right, has the different names of the different neighborhoods in Asheville. Next slide. Here's a 6-plex on the left, Chestnut Street. This is beautiful 1920s building. And there's a 20-unit building here. This is right behind the Harris Teeter and Trader Joe's in North Asheville. That admittedly is a larger part of the middle housing. Typical middle housing is smaller, but these larger structures are more prevalent on commercial corridors and where cities want to have a higher intensity of use. All right, next slide. So what can middle housing provide Asheville? Here's a bulleted list that you can browse. And while I'm talking about this image on the right, this is showing the yellow is the residential zoning districts that only permit single family housing. So in these yellow areas, middle housing is not permitted. And it's the majority of residential land, 66%. So we have a lot of our land where for many years now, the housing choices have been restricted. So what this study points to is that by allowing people to construct more housing opportunities, we're allowing things like this: more housing choice, more mixed income neighborhoods, people who are getting old and want to stay in their neighborhoods, but they don't have the ability or the interest in maintaining a large yard and a house. They'd like to age in place. Missing the middle housing can provide that. Changes to zoning that allow for middle housing allow for incremental growth, because what happens is that you get small changes throughout the city in residential districts occurring over time. It's not like a large 300-unit project occurs and it's a striking change. This happens incrementally over a generation. These tend to be more attainable and they're compatible. So there are a lot of reasons for understanding that it makes sense to allow more of these housing opportunities where they're currently banned in Asheville. Next slide, please. So we can pause for questions if you have any. Yes.
Hi, Vidal. Yes, I was just looking at some of the areas where they were actually banning, little housing selections, whatever. I do remember, did they change the zoning when they went in with urban renewal? Did they change the zoning in any way? Because I remember growing up in the South Side area where we had those type of housing units that they had in Montfort. We had on Livingston, there were family units and things like that. But when they came in and replaced them, they didn't really, did they change the zoning or did they do the lots the way they divide the lots for homes? What exactly happened there?
Without looking at the specific area, it would be hard for me to say. I don't know specifically there.
In other words, they did have middle housing, just like in Montfort and those areas. They had those in the South Side. And I notice now, I don't see very few. I know a couple, but I guess those that were torn down were never replaced. And I'm just wondering about that zoning. Was there a change in that where people didn't build?
There may have been. Yeah, we have to look at the specific area to see if the zoning had changed. It may be that it didn't change. I'm speculating, but it may be just that the primary single family house construction took over. I'm not sure. We'd have to.
You know what I was just thinking? I think you're right. And the only reason I'm saying that, Vidilla, the big lot that sits there right there at Hill Street right now, the 8+ acres that was just recently sold. And it's so funny you said that because I had a lot that was on the market, which was only about 6,000 square feet, and it's actually zoned RM16.
Exactly.
So I was just thinking about that. You're right.
So what this highlights and the study acknowledges is that there is a trend and maybe in the building community, it's very easy to build single family housing. It's very much understood. It's easier to construct. There are more builders who do it. And so there's a lot of momentum to continue in the single family movement, in the construction of single unit structures. And in many cases, even when the zoning allows for middle housing, we still tend to get these single unit structures. So the study is pointing to the city looking at other ways to incentivize the construction of more different types of housing. So this isn't just a zoning problem. We need to look at how we process and permit and even speaking with banks and trying to understand the financing better so that the building community can move in this direction.
Thank you.
All right, we can go to the next slide unless there are any other questions. All right, so I already mentioned that the study concludes that single detached housing is not going to solve the problem. Even if we found a lot of land, the construction of single unit buildings tends to be more expensive. So the general policy guidance and the consultants looked at some prototypical lots, in this case in a multifamily district, found that on the left image, you would typically get about 2 single family homes built on this type of a parcel. One of them would be interior, not facing the street, and they would tend to build out as large as they can because it just makes sense when you're putting in that much infrastructure that you maximize your profit. And so you can build up to 4 stories in residential districts. And the consultants are suggesting that perhaps we allow for more units, but reduce the size and the bulk of structures to guarantee that as the housing pressure continues, we don't get buildings that are disproportionate to the size of the neighborhood. They don't point specifically to what that height should be. 2 stories, maybe 2.5 stories. In some cases, maybe 3. We've heard from building community that with our topography, we might want to be a little bit, be cautious to not be too restrictive. But they're suggesting that is a direction that we should be going so that at least new construction incorporates the middle housing. Next slide. The study also concludes that some parts of our city have more vulnerable populations that are more susceptible to displacement when there is significant housing pressure. And they looked at vulnerability based on income, race, education, and whether you own or rent. And so there are lots of maps and analysis, but this image on the right highlights what they show as kind of the green being the lowest vulnerability, where there's the highest opportunity for missing middle zoning changes and changes. The yellow has high vulnerability but low rates of change, and then the red is sort of the parts of the city that we want to be most cautious, where we roll out any changes. And I want to pause just to highlight that red doesn't mean stop or don't go in this map. It means to be more cautious. And this is important when looking at the recommendations and the anti-displacement strategies, because actually part of the recommendations point to middle housing as an anti-displacement strategy, because in the long term, they tend to be more attainable in price. The concern is always when you change zoning and you may implement a policy that will lead to longer term increasing housing units. It may put short-term pressure on there that may force some people to have to find other housing. So these areas we need to be more sensitive to. Yes, we can take a question.
So, and I don't know if you have this info on your next coming slides, but when I looked over the study in its entirety, it mentioned specific neighborhoods, and I'm hoping you know those neighborhoods, because just on this map with the colors, I think folks might not know. I believe the study said that the Easton Valley Street neighborhood and Shiloh were the two most gentrified neighborhoods in the city. And parts of Oakley were right there on the edge of displacement. And also, just going back to your point about how missing middle can actually be helpful, keep in mind, this is kind of the same thought process that we deal with when we're talking about AMIs. So you might find yourself in a situation where, even though missing middle is less expensive than other dwelling units throughout the city, it still might be at a price point that is significantly higher than the residents of that area, therefore just causing displacement, albeit with folks who earn less than the primary displacers. So just keep that in mind. So if you can name these neighborhoods, I think that would be really helpful. I know I saw something about South Side. So it really lines up with the redlining maps, from the end of last century. So it's interesting. So if you could name those neighborhoods, it would be great.
Sure. No, those are some really good points. And you're right. There are parts of Shiloh, parts of Oakley. It mentions South French Broad neighborhood, going all the way up north into parts of Montford, some East End. This is somewhat tricky because the data that they use is 10-year data, and some of these neighborhoods have already gentrified such that in the data, Burton Street is shown as not as being having very low vulnerability, and that's partially because it sort of changed so much already. So we have to take this data with a bit of grain of salt. I think you're right also that when we're talking about the pricing of middle housing, we're talking about new construction. So when we say that it tends to be more attainable, what the study means is that more attainable compared to new construction of, say, single family. But you're right, those new units, let's say somebody builds, instead of building a home, now that's crazy, a single family home, they're on the market for $1 million in Asheville. So a duplex may go for 500,000. That's still not affordable in most people's minds, but the price point is lower. So it is heading in the right direction, but we don't in any way want to send the wrong message that this is affordable housing. We're trying to move in a direction to have a policy or to allow for policies to encourage more attainable housing, but it's still, for the new construction, because of the price of goods and labor and materials, is still really quite high. So that is definitely needs to be acknowledged. And the report is clear about that. Did I answer your questions?
Vidila, if I could help a little bit in terms of what I think this is suggesting to us is that whatever strategy is utilized to encourage both housing choices and hopefully affordability, that the underlying, goal should be based upon anti-displacement overall. I don't care if it's just the green area, yellow area, red area. Our approach to strategies to encourage affordability should be, and choice should be about also an anti-displacement strategy as well, which means that when we are looking at the implementation of missing middle and many, many other strategies that will be needed to address this issue, that should be a fundamental, value for us, that we will go into it with a anti-displacement approach.
And let me just add really quickly that in the anti-displacement strategies,
Yikes, he froze.
So this is important to remember because some...
Vidila, you froze for a minute, so can you repeat what you were getting ready to say? And then we'll go to Antoinette for a question.
Yes, just to remember that I think this is sort of counterintuitive, so it's important to highlight that anti-displacement strategies some strategies are short-term. For example, providing assistance to tenants who are being evicted is a very short-term anti-displacement strategy. And that's very different from a strategy that will allow for more housing opportunities in a neighborhood that may lead to more construction of more units and have more housing, but it's a much longer-term strategy. That's all.
Antoinette?
So my question actually, and I'm just going to step out on a tangent for just a second. I'm wondering if it is our desire, or is it our goal to utilize what we've learned as far as displacement strategies go for missing middle to take that knowledge into other areas? And I'll tell you what I'm thinking about. When we did the 8-week projection of what's going to come before us, I'm wondering if we're going to take the things we've learned with the missing middle study and apply them to the flag lot discussion, specifically for different neighborhoods. And then later, Brad, what does that look like when you're dealing with an ordinance for the entire city? Is there a way to, I hate to say exclude certain neighborhoods, but is there a way to do that lawfully in North Carolina? Does that question make sense?
Yes, Councilmember Ramos, I'll just I don't want to interrupt the presentation, but just briefly, to a degree, I think it is hypothetically possible. Now, there's a lot of moving pieces to that, and with every give and take, there is an equal and opposite reaction that it'll be up to council to determine whether or not that is the best path forward and how to divide those lines. But I think that there's a great deal of legal ground in which you can work to be able to a degree, be somewhat surgical with this approach. Now, the more surgical you are, perhaps you lose some of the benefit of the proposal on one side, but you perhaps gain some protections on another. So I think I'm speaking very high level right now because I don't want to get ahead of the process nor council's philosophical leanings on this. But I do think that there is more than just simply a do this or don't do this bilateral option here.
And if I could add, and Fidel and Chris, you guys are I'm the former planner, you guys are the existing planners. But I think that there could be, for example, for some of these communities, there could be separate overlay districts that are created that have different development standards that are unique to or related to trying to preserve character, that just looking more specifically and contextually about these actual geographies. They may have, again, may have different demographics, but they may also have different architectural style that we would want new development to blend in with, so that we can customize is actually what I'm trying to get at. And Chris?
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you said that, Deborah. And and Vidal, I don't know if it's in this map or not. And I know as we go further down the presentation, we talk about doing appropriate things in appropriate areas, which is what we're talking about right now. And that includes information on displacement risk and economic pressures and housing pressures on neighborhoods. It also will include information on the built environment, how well certain areas are served by infrastructure. There are a lot of factors that have to play into where this is appropriate, and that's part of the implementation of this as we move forward.
And Maggie, I'm sorry, I think we jumped ahead of you.
You're fine. I was up and then I was down. It's just, this is one of those things where, like, I'm very excited about this study. I feel like the nuance is really useful. So I could talk about at every point, but I'm trying to restrain myself. But there are a couple of things I want to share in this specific conversation. The point about when you look at the various displacement strategies, the various supply strategies, and the fact that we might not be doing X citywide. We might be looking at what's appropriate where is very exciting to hear, because I do think that for a long time, we didn't have equity considerations in our zoning, right? So this displacement information is really, really powerful to kind of look at how we can make sure that we're making choices now for 20 years from now that have more equitable impacts. And so I'm very excited about that. I also think that, you know, the level of detail in the mapping is just very useful, right? Because a zoning change in a certain neighborhood will have very different impacts in other neighborhoods. And so I'm really hopeful that we can be executing low-hanging fruit very soon. I think some of this, looking at I think you said, Vidal, 40 plus strategies, some of those I think are very much low-hanging fruit. And especially if we're looking at it in the nuance of where X is appropriate in the community. And to that end, I think that a question I have is, you know, you look at this map and there's actually 3 colors or 4 colors, but there's only 3 on the map. So the 3 on the map are the red, yellow, green, but then there's the beige, or there's huge chunks of our city that aren't mapped at all in this study. That it appears that the fundamental starting point of this is that missing middle is only appropriate in a close proximity to major transportation corridors. And I just wanted to hear some more of what's underlying that assumption. What's the downside of having missing middle more broadly? I think that, you know, it really jumped out to me that we need 7,500 new front doors in 15 years. When we say that there's a housing shortage, that's real. And so what is exciting here is that we're not blindly saying more. we're saying there's an impact on displacement that is already in motion and that is fragile and needs a huge amount of focus. So I'm really eager to start digging into those displacement strategies early. And it appears that a bunch of our city isn't even being mapped for some of these considerations. And I'd love to understand more of the why behind that.
I'll try to answer that before Councilman Roney goes. So yes, the report is clear that the most applicable and appropriate areas for middle housing changes are those areas closest to walkable neighborhoods, closest to access to transit, and closest to goods and services, which tend to be closer to the core of the city. So, and to those areas within the map, because you can see some of these are green south of, South Asheville, that those are most appropriate. That doesn't mean that there isn't a good reason to include changes to allow efficient housing options in other places, but probably not at the same intensity level. So that's the key point here.
Can you drill in, because I feel like the technical expertise you're bringing as a planner, there's just some like more assumptions in what you're seeing. I just want to understand more, like, what do you mean by appropriate? Like, I'm not trying to be antagonistic. I'm really trying to be like, help me understand where you're thinking when you say applicable and appropriate. Like, can you just dig in a little bit more and kind of educate us on that thinking?
Yeah, I think it means when you're thinking of impact and prioritization, that you want to first allow for more housing units closest to where they make the most sense. And they make the most sense where you can catch a bus, and so a developer may not need to provide parking because they're so close to a bus stop. And one of the recommendations in the study is to consider reductions in parking, right? So adding housing intensity closest to the core makes a lot of sense for linking up with our other city investments in transit, in sidewalks, in walkability, and in goods and services where those stores are. But that doesn't mean that that we can't have missing middle housing, allowing duplexes in other parts of the city where you may have the same footprint as a single family home, but instead of having a 2,000 square foot home, you have two 1,000 square foot duplex units.
Got it.
So there's a little nuance there.
And so, like, adding to that, you're mentioning where there's transit, but also just where there's roads. Like, we hear a lot from community members who are concerned about traffic volumes. You all know me, I'm a very multimodal advocate, but I think there is some reality there of what municipal infrastructure exists and that tends to be consolidated around these corridors. So that's kind of one of the assumption modes there. And then the other thing I hear is about like inherent prioritization. And I see value there. However, in the way the study is presented, it's not necessarily presented as prioritization because the study doesn't even have those parcels on the table. And so I just wonder, I think the prioritization that you're saying makes a lot of sense. And so I appreciate you kind of peeling back the onion layers of that, but that's implicit in this, not explicit, because what is explicit is that those places aren't even on the maps. They aren't even acknowledged as part of a strategy. And so I just wonder if we should tease that out further as we're getting towards recommendations, because it reads as these are not appropriate at all for consideration, and that's not what I hear you saying. And so given how dire the shortage is and how we are seeing housing being built that is largely single family, which is largely serving only folks of certain incomes, I wonder if we need to tease that out a little further as this moves along.
Yeah, good points. I think those are good points. One thing.
Let me ask Videla. Chris, was there anything else you want to add? And then we've got Ms. Roney.
No, I'm okay right now. I think as we get through the presentation, there are a few points on the implementation should address all these maps and appropriate areas are definitely a key factor of what we got to figure out. So,
Ms. Roney?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short since it seems like we might have just derailed the presentation a bit. I'll just start with appreciation for the study. I think especially with the addition of recommendations to address displacement. But Deborah, I know you always like for us to begin with the end in mind. And my end in mind is an interest in a community benefits table with overlay maps as a path to achieve our goal for equitable, affordable housing. And for me, the benefits table could include different levels of transportation options. So for example, South Asheville's 90-minute service is less reliable than West Asheville's 20-minute service, but they're both in the green area. And so I think a benefits table could provide that clarity. And then parts of North Asheville have transit that ends before 8 o'clock, and Montford ends at 8 o'clock. So if we're not providing the above and below ground infrastructure, then just having an overlay map for the green areas doesn't address the fact that we may not be providing the infrastructure to support them the same way. So I definitely support density on transit corridors. When I read the 155-page study and I'm doing community engagement to better understand what concerns are, I have some other questions that I'll wait till another part of the presentation. But what I'm hearing is that if we just move forward with zoning changes without that equitable or equity lens in our goal of equitable affordable housing that we all agreed to, then we risk the potential of not doing the displacement infrastructure first. And I think that the risk is pretty high in not meeting our goal.
Thank you for that. Before going on, I just wanted to mention one thing when hearing about the opportunities and neighborhoods. One thing that we heard from the consultants over several times, and it's in the report, is that housing pressure continues whether or not a neighborhood is granted more housing opportunities. So the prices of homes will still continue to go up. Sometimes I think we think if we don't change the zoning, somehow we're preserving things as they are today. And that's not accurate with reality. So just something to keep in mind.
And a follow-up to that, I would say, is that if there was an opportunity to build on this as we look at phasing it in the recommendations, what does it look like to align the missing middle housing study recommendations, our open space, and our affordable housing incentives at the 60% AMI? If they're all in alignment and we're saying it is time to release some pressure valves so that we can get to the level of units that will get us closer to our goal of equitable affordable housing, but we know that 80% AMI isn't cutting it, then the question about what is affordable, whether it's in the missing middle housing section part of the study or the displacement part of the study, affordable, attainable, if we're not in alignment across the board, then if we release the floodgates of the ADU part without things like short-term vacation rental compliance tools, we could make the problem worse.
And this is exactly, and I know, Ms. Mosley, you have your hand raised, at least you did. And this is exactly why we are having this conversation in this format, and because this is only study, right? And so it gave us some suggestions. We have the opportunity now to work together as well as with the community to find out what would be the best way to go about implementing what we hope is our goal of anti-displacement, increasing affordable housing and choices, and where would they be appropriate. So this is, we're not at the end. We are really at the beginning. Now we have the data. Now we need to come up with the strategies in terms of implementation. And guess what? We don't have to do anything that they said do, because we may come up with some other ideas, but I think that it was worth doing this analysis in the study, that they do have, and they have identified a number of things, possible things that we can do. Where we actually implement them is still debatable. Ms.
I
Mosley.
agree. I agree. I do think that if we were to fill in the shading inside the city where we're at a fourth column where it's like, this isn't really where it's appropriate. Like, just to go ahead and say that, put it on the map. And then another thing is like, be able to zoom in and say like, this is where we have the infrastructure or we don't.
Sounds good. I think we can do that as part of definitely our path forward, next steps. Ms. Mosley.
Actually, I took my hand down because I wasn't going to say what I'm getting ready to say, but now I'm going to go ahead and say it.
Oh, man, I'm just kidding.
Bedelia mentioned about how either way, prices will go up. I think it's very important to recognize that from the perspective of the folks living in the community, displacement is not only a function of the increase in housing prices. You could run the risk of, even though you include more houses at a lower price point, the influx of more people could technically lead to the displacement culturally for these communities. So that's also a concern that is not usually presented. What I'm thinking of, quite frankly, is West Asheville, and you mentioned Burton Street. One of the reasons that that's probably not included in red is because their displacement is complete, right? And so West Asheville has a totally different cultural vibe than it did when I was growing up. So when you're dealing, say, for instance, with an East End that already lost 50% of the families with homes living there, if you come back and replace that 50% and include more, it's an even greater displacement culturally speaking.
Yeah, it's interesting nuance, and it's very complicated. Good points. Thank you for that.
I just want to riff on that for a second, because I think there's something I've been marinating that's similar to that, Antoinette, and I like the way that you're articulating it. Because again, when you're looking at these maps and the different colors, including the fourth non-color that's kind of presented here, it just makes you wonder, like, where has the most migration, if you will, or displacement or lack of displacement happened? And the places
East End and Yellow.
And where has the least movement happened historically and over time? And so if you look at it not only from where has it happened, I think there's an interesting question of where hasn't it happened, right? Because we know by enabling or not enabling certain zoning that we have seen it happen certain places, but I think the inverse of that is the luxury of not even having anything close to displacement. And I kind of wonder if it's the parts on the map that haven't been highlighted. You know what I'm saying?
When I look at it, I would say it's probably the green areas.
Well, what about the white areas that aren't in green?
I think those are so far out that it technically makes them, in many instances, less desirable in the first place. So you'll notice, but I can't see which neighborhoods those are, because we get to a certain part and those are technically in the county. A lot of the white parts.
Well, the stuff within our black line, right? Like if you look
that would be stuff in the city.
Right, in the city within the black lines that aren't green, yellow, or red.
And I'll just highlight that there are a lot of other maps that include gentrification, so we can get lost in this. If you don't mind, if we can get through the rest of this and then have the in-depth questions, that would be, can we do that? Okay, next slide, please. All right, so what does the study conclude? I mentioned the 43 recommendations fall within different categories: policy, zoning, and implementation. Here, we're just highlighting a few of the examples for you and the audience to see. Policy recommendations: reinforcing walkable environments. That doesn't sound like housing, but it's synergistic with housing, and having fewer cars. Preserving existing neighborhood character, reviewing and clarifying next steps for our corridors as transformational potential, right? Primarily, this discussion about middle housing is about residential districts, but there are a lot of other places where we can have housing, and so they're reinforcing that we need to continue those that focus in these ways as well. A few zoning recommendations. They're saying to update the standards instead of requiring more process, to try to clarify and make wholesale changes. Refining building heights. In this regard, they're suggesting that we actually reduce what we allow today. So this isn't all about opening up the gates, so to speak. It's also about pulling back where it makes sense for contextuality, and suggesting reducing parking requirements, because in many cases, if people have to decide if they don't have enough room on their parcel, should we require them to do parking if they don't need it, especially in cases where they're close to transit. For implementation, they're suggesting to establish the in-house implementation team to allow additional units for deeper affordability. I think this is what Councilman Roney was getting at, and providing pre-approved building plans. Other communities have done this just to make it easier for the public to get access to what might be built in their land. Slide. Perfect. Maggie? Oh, it was Councilman Ullman left. Okay. So how do we plan? We have three slides here. One is to establish a missing middle housing implementation team with outside stakeholders. The study suggests we do an internal team, but we're suggesting that we should open this up to the outside as well. And these are the core interest groups, if we want to call them that we think should be involved, but that should be a smaller team. We've been working with a group of about 19 people as an advisory working group, and it's too difficult to work with a large group if we're looking to be responsive and to make changes so that we actually create some change, because we know this is a very important topic that we need to address. So these are some of the key stakeholders that we would suggest working with us as we move forward. Next slide, please. We suggest that we prioritize a package that has a bunch of changes that are impactful, that are relatively low-hanging fruit, easier to implement, so that we can kind of move forward with what is easiest to achieve. Right? We can't do all 43 changes at once. So this is just a list suggesting some of the changes that might be easier to, well, not all of them would be easier to achieve, but some of them would be. Allowing ADUs more broadly, for example. We currently allow accessory dwelling units. We could open up the regulations to make them a little bit easier, especially now that there is financing that allows for people to build them more easily. Prioritizing the updates in the most appropriate areas. We talked about this a little bit. Encouraging smaller units across the board. The study is even suggesting that we possibly, other cities have done, capping the size of single family homes. We might not want to go that far, but they list that as an opportunity. Reducing or eliminating off-street parking requirements. Establishing maximum lot coverage standards. What this does is it responds to this concern about tree canopy. If we ensure that you can only build on a smaller footprint, it allays a lot of concerns from those who are passionate about the environment and trees. And then a couple of others. But again, this is just an idea that a team could sort of work through and really struggle through the maps and the realities of Asheville and the political realities to see what kind of makes sense. Next slide. And then knowing that we can't achieve everything immediately, continuing a longer term conversation with community discussions and public engagement to inform whatever the second phase or third phase or, just ongoing next steps would be. And we're suggesting possibilities here, virtual meetings, neighborhood meetings, informational videos, so that, a lot of people don't want to attend any kind of a meeting. So just something to understand what's going on, surveys, open house sessions with staff, and any other ideas that council or the public can come up with. Next slide. So the possible schedule for phase one, this is quite expedited, but knowing that housing is urgent, we could establish this team this month. And we actually have the larger advisory team, so we're suggesting to take a smaller group from that team to discuss and refine and filter that priority list to come to the Planning and Economic Development Committee in February with at least the initial ideas to get guidance from them. And then to review possible changes with boards and commissions and to begin this iterative process with the public so that this isn't, public bureaucrats making the decisions, but that we're engaging with the public and having some real feedback from people who are involved heavily as volunteers or the public. And then potentially to taking this through the formal process beginning in the summertime. Next slide. So we're wrapping up here. Just the key takeaways again, that this is really just a study to inform our comprehensive review of housing that's going to be supported by the affordable housing plan that's currently being developed with the city and other UDO updates that we're looking to make. The suggestion that single family housing production is not sufficient, that we need to move in a different direction. And for the long-term vision of the city for the next generation, we have plenty of housing stock for single unit structures. We need to move in a direction that incentivizes more units, more efficient units. And we have lots of recommendations and anti-displacement strategies to consider with community discussion. And if we're successful in all this, we will have more housing choices, more robust, diverse housing options for all of Asheville. Thank you. And the next slide, I believe, is just the closing. Yes, so we can open up for questions and discussion.
Ms. Rowley?
Thank you, Vidila. I know this is something that our community needs, and I appreciate your careful attention and the way that you presented. I think that the videos on the city's website were really helpful in being able to share with the public. Unfortunately, they're too long for short form like Instagram. So it meant recording them on my TV, breaking them into 3 different sections just to be able to post it. So being able to get information out to the public about this is helpful, but I think we have a couple learning tools. If y'all could send the paper presentations that you've handed out, I think that there were like 4 different infographic sheets. That would be helpful for us to engage folks, be able to point folks in different information directions. One of the concerns that I think we're going to have to be able to address is that more ADUs being at the top of our list of priorities while we don't have a grasp on short-term vacation rental compliance is going to be a sticking point for some folks. So it either needs to be not at the top of our list or it's our highest priority and we have got to make enforcement a high priority. Otherwise, we're just going to be building lateral hotels all over the city. I think another issue that's coming up is what are we going to do about what affordability means? Because it does get addressed throughout the study. And so while we're having a deeper conversation, I think you used the word the philosophy or the philosophical stance of council. I think while we're communicating with the public about what affordability means, we might want to talk really plainly about what that percentage of AMI means. And I think I've heard recommendations like at our last meeting from council member Mosley about what that means for like annual salaries, because folks need to be able to see themselves in this story. So those are my recommendations on just being able to communicate plainly with the public on what this means and why we need it, but also own that we have some real challenges around short-term vacation rental compliance.
Ms. Kilgore.
Okay, and I think, I don't know if Kim touched on that, it got sort of phased out, but, and I think that, I noticed that it really didn't talk a lot about the ownership, portion. And I'm just wondering, how does that fit in, especially with council priorities as opposed to housing? And when we talk about multi-units, basically, fourplexes, eightplex, sixplexes, those are perfect vehicles to be able to use and be able to use those as for ownership possibilities. Because if you can get 6 units into a building that's 1.2 million, that means that every unit is about 200, that type of thing, that type of housing gives us ownership opportunity, which would be just sort of, it'll be easier almost to qualify for ownership in these units. And also the fact that it takes a lot of responsibilities of a lot of the developments as far as taking care of it, because ownership, requires so much the person themselves to be able to participate in implementing and maintaining. So I'm sort of looking at, we need to really sort of bring that into the arena when we're talking to the community, because like I said, it's cheaper for them to own than rent in these particular sceneries where you have buildings that have multiple units in it that are being sold for 200,000 or 250. Does that make sense? And I think that's something that we need to talk to people about, because that's what people are concerned about, being able to own something and move on, because it's just like a stepping stone to get them to another level. So
Yeah.
are we bringing that in when we talk about the study, or how to approach it? Because like Antoinette was saying, basically if you look at duplexes, you've got $1 million duplex, it's still $500,000 each. So, and that's the reason why we talk about smaller units. And one thing I will say, that you did say, but a lot of the builders, Menards actually have a lot of issues, are now building tiny houses, and their houses are becoming smaller, because that's what the economy is actually leaning towards. So that is big.
And I think that what we are all getting at is certainly we need to do the very detailed analysis in terms of, as we move forward, what's going to be both economic, cultural, social impacts as we think about whatever strategy we're going to implement related as a result of this study. But I think we're saying we need to look holistically at all of our tools and look holistically at all of our city goals to ensure that we are meeting them in the most efficient and impactful manner, a positive impact on the community, that we need to connect dots. That, for example, if we're doing this in middle and we're trying to encourage homeownership, then we need to look at a regulatory strategy. We need to look at a financial strategy. We need to look at multiple things, and not just, again, one secret sauce is not going to solve this complicated social and economic issue for our community. So there's a lot of layers of things that we need to look at, and we need to look at it in the context of when we're saying we're going to do this strategy related to missing middle, whether it's ADUs, it's like you said, Ms. Ronnie, then layer all of those other potential unintended consequences on the table, and then try to mitigate with whatever other tools and strategies we may have. Anything else? Ms. Alma?
I am so appreciative of this conversation, because I just like Kim mentioned, it's 150 pages, and I combed through it, and hearing everyone else's kind of first take on it. I'm wondering, there's a lot of strategies and recommendations. There are low-hanging fruit, but I'm wondering what our centralized goal is, like what we are all sharing to work towards, because I do see a risk with this range and volume of strategies that, like how this is connecting to our council priorities. So last year when we dug in. I think that of our 6 top priorities from the retreat, the housing one was one of the more focused. It had a broad range, but I think that there was some more clarity there, and it's really clear this council is very focused on attainable housing and housing. I just wondered, I like the proposed timeline and approach. I love the idea of working with the excellent folks who were on the Missing Middle study and kind of a subset of them to really dig into these recommendations. I also wonder if there's some goal level conversation that we would want at PED or maybe the retreat, but I think there's still a wide range of perspective of how we're absorbing these recommendations from council. And so there might be a process along the way with what you've already proposed to help us have further conversation. And maybe that's in committee, but maybe it's elsewhere. I don't know exactly what that would look like. I just am kind of reflecting on our perspective.
We can kind of go back, I think, Maggie, as a result of this conversation, and maybe do some processing and come back with in addition to the subcommittee of the advisory group, what other, Fidel, as part of your presentation, didn't you have touching base with PED or who? Okay.
Yes, we're suggesting that we would form this group and refine the possible strategies and next steps and report to PED in as early as February if we can achieve that, if not March, and then have PED give us guidance.
And I think maybe just a bit of a tweaking, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, Maggie, but I think what we've been trying to do with some of the committees is to start with the committees first to kind of get a broad overview of, what might be some goals. We could bring them back that information and say, are we missing something? Is there some refinement or whatever? So we'll debrief and come back and present some information in terms of a path forward.
Yeah, and I think tying it back to, what we had listed as our affordable housing goals at council,
Yes.
This was one that had a little bit more of a list because we understand this is not, you can't just do displacement. You can't just do supply, like it needs to be packaged. And so kind of tying some of these strategies saying, okay, well, this one is connected to this part of the goal. I'm not really sure, but we can't just do one strategy. This set of recommendations shows us a bunch of those. And what I hear from my peers is us seeing different parts of the solution and being really excited and advocating for those different parts. But I'm hoping that we all agree that it's nothing as a one solution. So if we can tease the conversation out to show the package of here are displacement strategies, here are supply strategies in the appropriate places and why, here are the ones for affordable, so that it's not us fighting over type of ways to address this, it's us knitting together the comprehensiveness across the goals. Because I think that there's a risk of us not being aligned because we're concerned that our goal within the suite of what needs to get done isn't getting enough air or attention when we need them all to be knitted together in order to address this systemically.
Agreed.
I'll add really quickly that we've spoken with Buncombe County and they're looking to do some related changes to missing middle and to manufactured housing overlays, as well as town of Woodfin. So ideally, we're going to do a little bit of cross-jurisdictional collaboration.
Okay, Mayor, we'll turn it back over to you if there are no further questions about missing middle. Is there anything else you all want to discuss?
I'm going to send a list of questions that I had from today, a little more narrow so that it makes it easier to follow up. One of the things that hasn't gotten brought up is issues with the tree canopy preservation ordinance. as well as how that fits in with steep slope. So if we are going to look at phasing this, my suggestion would be something like put ADUs and steep slopes in a later phase once we figure out how to be more proactive and ready to handle our stormwater issues and short-term vacation rental compliance.
So noted.
Okay, is there anything further from anyone? Otherwise, we'll see each other on Tuesday. All right.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate the conversation. Thanks a lot. Have a good day.